Okay, well, we're live now. Professor, I'm wondering if having you tell me just a little bit about your own background and relevant personal experience.
Sure. Uh, in general, my background's in fields like economics, geography, and urban planning. And in particular, I was drawn into the study of mega events, of which the World Cup is just one, by actually working at one. Many years ago, 1993, Michigan State University was invited to help staff the US pavilion at the World's Fair in Daejeon, Korea. And I was one of the faculty members, and so we actually lived and worked in a World's Fair. And we did it again in '98, and we worked in 2005. So I got interested in mega events just through working at them and seeing them from the inside. And so when I had the opportunity to expand that, we started studying the Olympics and the World Cup. So they're a class of event that I'm really interested in just because they're so unusual. They're very prestigious, they're large scale, but sometimes the glamour stops people asking the important questions.
What are the important questions for you?
Well, for us, a lot of the questions are about where does the value lie in the event? Because the event itself has value. But my colleagues and I that study mega events would say that often too many people focus on the event as the end and walk away. When in fact I would argue that it's what you use the event to achieve. It should be a means to an end. So a mega event is great, spirited, wonderful event, but you should get more from it than that. If you're going to spend billions of dollars on an event, it should make the host city a better place to live when it's all over. It shouldn't be simply seen as, oh, we've thrown this big party. It should be, this party helped us get a better airport, a better road system, better public transit, some public parks. It should be a way to get a lot more out of the quality of life for the people in the city.
And what would you include in the category of mega event? You mentioned the Olympics, the World Cup, World's Fairs. What else?
They would be the three biggest ones, but just a little lower in scale would be continent-wide sporting events. So we have the Pan American Games for the Americas being held in Toronto next year. We have the Asian Games, the All Africa Games. We even have things like the European Culture Capital, where one city for 1 year will focus a lot of effort and attention on one event. You can even go to include religious pilgrimages. The 3 million people that make a pilgrimage to Mecca every year are usually classified as a mega event. A lot of people participating in one thing for a short period.
I see. Interesting. And can you tell soccer or football, as it's called, and the World Cup? How do you explain this sport's popularity? Most popular sport in the world, right?
It is, and I think it's one of the things that you miss living in the United States. You don't get a sense of the importance of the game. People in other countries at the moment are being bombarded with far more information, programming, marketing associated with the World Cup. And in the US, it's still a very low-key event. I think one of the reasons it's a popular game is that it's very simple. It doesn't take a lot of equipment. Frequently, in many countries, in many poor countries, you will see people playing soccer on a field with minimal equipment. And even young children starting out can play the game without very much preparation. Compared to other forms of football, like American football, that often demand a lot more equipment if it's played professionally.
I see. And why do you think it hasn't been as popular in the United States? Are there some well understood reasons for that?
I think one of the reasons is the strength of American football. But one of the features that I've been surprised at is that there is a lot of attention in K-12 schools to soccer teams for both men and women, for boys and girls. A lot of kids learn to play soccer when they're young. But as they move into high school, the emphasis seems to be on American football. That takes over as perhaps one of the most important games. And so you have now a generation that's in college, in their 20s, who may well have played soccer when they were younger, but it does not seem to have continued through that age group. I mean, that said, there's a lot of leagues and local games being played that don't really break into the news very often. But there's still a lot of people that love playing the game.
I see. Yes, that's interesting. That's an interesting phenomenon. Let me ask city selection process. Can you give me an overview of generally how it works, where a city would bid for these mega events, and is the World Cup different from the Olympics in that regard?
Yeah, it is very different. For the Olympics and World's Fairs, there is usually a fair amount of competition. Any city in the world will go through its national body, like the U.S. Olympic Committee, and it will choose from its domestic options a city to take forward to the Olympics or to take forward to, I say, a World's Fair. Until recently, the World Cup selection process is based on a country rather than a city, because the World Cup demands that you have a dozen cities that are ready and able to compete for the privilege of hosting the World Cup. Also, FIFA in the past has used a continental system where it rotated the rights to the World Cup through continents. Interestingly, Brazil was unopposed for the South American host of the World Cup. That Argentina and Colombia were both interested, but Brazil was the only country that came forward. So unusually for these types of events, there was no competition. Brazil was the only Latin American country to bid, and their bid was accepted by FIFA. Now, for the games in 2018 and 2022, there was a lot of competition. And the selection of some of those cities has been highly controversial, in particular the selection of the cities of Qatar to host the 2022 World Cup. There were many claims and allegations made of improprieties in the selection process, and whether or not holding the 2022 in a Middle East summer is the most logical time and place for a World Cup, as well as allegations of the human rights cost of building facilities using very low-paid international workers brought to Qatar to do the construction. So on one hand, it's a game, but underneath that game, there are a lot of political and social issues that come to the surface. But to go back to your first question, Brazil was unopposed for the 2014 World Cup. But usually there's a lot of interest in being the host because it's a very high visibility event. You have billions of people watching your cities, your country, for an extended period.
I see. And why does the World Cup require multiple cities in a country when something like this only requires one city?
And that's a good question. I'm not sure why FIFA requires so many stadiums, because essentially each city has to provide a stadium. And this is the core of a lot of the issues around cost and preparations. Part of it is there's a lot of games that need to be played. But part of it is also that not every stadium is fully used for the entire time. And in fact, the creation of a lot of white elephants results. Many past hosts of the World Cup are populated with stadiums that don't get very much use anymore.
And what is thinking from an economics standpoint, Professor? I've definitely heard that a mega event is a big boom, and then there are always these critical voices that say that it usually is a bust. What do the numbers say?
The studies that have been done actually point more to the bust than the boom. But part of the decision is who benefits. So there are always groups that come out of a World Cup who benefit. That they, through marketing, through the fact that they profited from building stadiums or building transit lines. But generally, the economic benefits of many mega events, especially the World Cup, tend to be overblown. And a study done on Germany's World Cup, for example, and the World Cups in France showed that the net result was not substantial. So we have examples of billions of dollars being spent, lots of new construction, certainly workers are paid, firms make a profit, but it doesn't bring a huge benefit to the host country.
Now, are there not controversies, but is there debate about what constitutes an economic benefit and what constitutes an economic cost, and how?
Yeah, you usually try and look at the costs and the benefits. So you would look at a city and say, well, this is how much is being spent on the stadium and the rail line or the preparation of the infrastructure. And then you would look at the long-term benefits. Is this something that needed to be built anyway? In which case, you could argue that it was a good investment. But if it's something that isn't used again, that if you have a stadium that is not used, someone has to pay to maintain it, then it really is a cost. One of the things that economics does is reminds us to look at the opportunity cost. What is the best use of the resources used? And I think that's at the core of the issues in Brazil at the moment. Many people, many residents of the host cities in Brazil are saying, is the billions of dollars being spent the best use of the money available? And a lot of the protests will raise issues about schools and housing and security, safety, clean water. There are many things that money can be spent on. What is the best use of that money? And of course, different groups will have different answers to that.
Are there ways to measure the benefits related to the increased profile and the increased visibility of the city and country?
Yeah, there are scholars that do try and measure the raised profile and visibility, and it does produce a blip for a few years. But you also have to follow through on the promise of that visibility. So Brazil at the moment has a high profile, and by the end of the World Cup it will have a higher profile. Lots more people will see images of it. They will see positive images, advertising of the cities. But if they also see protests and poor housing conditions, then the visibility of the game may not be so important. The game may have brought you there, but can you follow through on what those games have promised through their marketing?
But can the results of this increased visibility be measured?
I have not done it. I have read several articles that have attempted to do this, but it is very difficult to capture. Someone may see the World Cup in Brazil, someone who's young may see it, and in 10 years decide that they want to go and see where it was played. It's very difficult to put the cause and effect together.
I see. How long has the World Cup been organized in this sort of way in different cities and countries? And are there examples of teams to have had a really big impact in a positive way on a city?
The World Cup's been going for over 80 years. And I think in the earlier days, the investments were smaller, they were more modest, they were things that were needed. But it's very hard to point to a lot of mega events in general as having a revolutionary change where they moved a city a dramatic distance in terms of its development. Uh, Many have had positive effects, but many have also distorted the city. They've built things for the city that it didn't need, it didn't want, it created white elephants, and that hasn't helped the cities at all. So generally care needs to be taken. Actually, the United States doesn't do too badly in the case of the World Cup because it had a lot of the facilities already. One of the reasons that US cities are so prepared is they have a lot of stadiums. And if they can resist the urge to overly rehab those stadiums, then a lot of them are in good condition and can be used for, say, soccer, and that can be quite positive. It's when you decide you want to build brand new stadiums and brand new facilities for something that lasts a couple of weeks. Cape Town took down a perfectly good stadium and built a brand new stadium for the South African World Cup. And many argue that that country had other priorities and that a slightly less glamorous stadium would have been perfectly acceptable. So part of the issue is the standards being demanded for hosting these events is scaring away possible hosts. And we've had a very strong example of this in the last couple of weeks for the 2022 Winter Olympics. A lot of the finalists have been withdrawing. And at the moment, we've had Stockholm withdraw, Krakow, Poland just withdrew a few days ago. Oslo has significant doubts about continuing, and that leaves China and Kazakhstan as the two remaining countries to host the 2022 Olympics. I think many residents of the host cities are seeing the costs and impacts of these events and deciding that it's not worth it.
I see. That's interesting. The way you're making the sound, Professor, is sort of like if cities were and countries were a person and hosting one of these fancy Rolex, and it's more of a signal that they want to show that they've arrived more than anything incredibly practical.
And in fact, that's a very good characterization. There's a number of scholars who look at these events like the Northwest Native American potlatch, where you have a big event, you have excessive giving to impress your neighbors, and we certainly saw that in Sochi with the Winter Olympics. A huge party, great expense to impress the world, but with very doubtful outcomes. So I think it's exactly the case. And some people can afford a Rolex, but many people can't. And the trouble is the people that can't afford them are the ones that are buying them.
I see. I see. Well, tell me about the selection process for FIFA. A purely political type of decision, or what drives their selection?
Well, often international event owners have two levels. They have a professional level, as does FIFA, where there will be professional engineers and transportation experts who will be evaluating the ability of a city or a country to host the event. But the decision is determined by the organization. And in FIFA's case, you have 20+ people who will vote on the location they want. And one of the allegations made against FIFA is that that has not been a particularly transparent or clear decision-making process, and that is causing great issues at the moment for FIFA, and to a lesser extent the IOC.
So this is 20 individuals that work the FIFA
No,
organization?
these are the executive committee of FIFA, which represents the global regional soccer coalitions. And so you can think of it in a parliamentary system, that they have countries they represent, and then they vote. But as individuals, they have a vast amount of influence over what the outcome will be.
I see. That makes sense. No, thank you, Professor. That brings some clarity. Can we talk a little bit now about how these mega events affect the city? So I'm sure people, when they think of these events, they think about increasing transportation networks, etc. Are there other things that are not as obvious in terms of do to prepare, or how these events affect the city?
Yeah, actually, it's a long-term process. It's a 10-year process, because you just don't go and build an airport overnight. You plan all of these things well in advance, and often cities, in order to get one of the big three of the Olympics, the World Cup, or a World's Fair, has been holding smaller events. They've held the Pan American Games or the UEFA Cup for soccer in Europe. They've held other events. But when they get a bigger event like this, the residents will certainly have a greater level of employment, especially based on construction. But there's also a lot of preparations that are not seen. Preparations around marketing, preparations about training. And sometimes those are very useful because it brings a lot of experience to the city, especially a city that has not a lot of international exposure. So one example was Shanghai for the World's Fair in 2010, which had over 65 million visitors. Shanghai spent a lot of time working with restaurants on translating menus into different languages, to making them friendly from visitors from different countries. They worked with the cab drivers on language, on how to greet people in different languages, on setting up telephone interpreter services. So Shanghai got this wonderful infrastructure for tourism that you don't really realize today came from the World's Fair. So in some cases there's training, experience, hotels might be more internationally aware, agreements, business might be more internationally aware. So there is a certain sense of the coming event, and a lot of that can be positive. Our argument would be the test really comes when the event is over. If you've built a new airport and it's exactly what you need, and after the event it's still used, that's great. If you build a new stadium and you have a team waiting to take it over, that's great. But if you build these things and no one wants them, then the residents of the city have really ended up inheriting a lot of white elephants.
I see. Is it just the maintenance costs?
Well, there is a maintenance cost. One of the most beautiful stadiums, I think, is the stadium for the Beijing Olympics. Ai Weiwei designed it, the Birds. Yeah, it's a beautiful stadium. It costs $11 million to maintain each year, and it has no team that can use it. They haven't been able to find a use for it. So here you have a beautiful piece of architecture. It's iconic, it's dramatic, and someone has to pay to keep it going. If you had found a use for it, or you'd built something a little more boring, then maybe there would be a use for it, but it would not have made the same statement. So it really is the value. If you were going to build these things anyway, then hosting a mega event makes sense. But if you just build them for this 1 month or this 1 6-week period, then I think it's worth asking awkward questions.
I see. And so it gets back to what you said earlier about opportunity cost.
Yeah.
These things probably take up a lot of land that could have been used for other purposes.
Exactly. Now, we're focusing more on the negative. I mean, there are cities that have inherited well, that have planned well. Barcelona, in particular, has done an extraordinary job. London did a very good job of its Olympics. So there are places that have done well. When Germany hosted the World Cup, it used a lot of existing stadiums that didn't need a lot of work done. In those cases, you can see there's been a worthwhile investment. But building brand new stadiums in places that won't use them, that's when you get a real detrimental impact, especially if you can't afford to have it. I think one of the things we're seeing is a ramping up in the expectations of what a country will do for an event. That it's not just a stadium that is acceptable. It has to be something dramatic, a star architect stadium. It has to be something that will really impress. And maybe our standards have got too high, that we need to scale back a little and think about what is acceptable for these events rather than always finding particularly expensive options.
I see. I see. And what are some of the big face in trying in leading up to the event? I imagine the coordination and there you always read about these construction delays. Is that
Yeah.
the other problems that they face?
Well, I think that on the pure infrastructure engineering side, you may need to build a subway system or add lines to a subway system, build rail lines. There can be a lot of construction. So you have the usual challenges of a major construction site. But you also have some social challenges. If this is not politically popular, if it's a cause of protest, if it becomes a rallying point, as it has in Brazil, for protests about the role of the state and what the government has promised and given the residents, then you have a completely separate set. Often we focus on the built environment, but this social side, this political side, also has to be seen as part of the calculus. Now, it could also be a way of giving a country pride or identity, and that certainly happened with South Africa. So there are many elements that come together, and some are positive, some are negative, some are disruptive, some are not. Each host will go through a different experience. This is a tailor-made event. That there are similarities across them, but essentially you're making this event brand new every time it is offered.
Yeah, one of the things that you mentioned, which was interesting, was the benefit of some of the preparatory activities and the coordination activities that are required. Here's a question for you. Is there a benefit that maybe hasn't had a history of great coordination? Is there a benefit in them producing an event like this to increase their capability coordinate large events and coordinate across public, private, across agencies, etc.? Is there a increases as a side benefit of this?
Yeah, that's a great question, actually. We would call it capacity building. And often you can build the capacity. One capacity that we often see is the ability to host future events. So now we have ramped up, we have held this event, Rio has held the World Cup, it should be in a good position, hopefully, to host the Olympics. But cities often see their ability to host an event. They can also, though, forge new institutional arrangements that make the city much more effective. It's a much more efficient system of getting things done. Now, one of the barriers to that is often special districts are created that have their own legal status that cover the area of the mega event. So the area of the Olympic Park will have special legal status. And suddenly, even countries that prided themselves on transparency have hundreds of acres of land in a special jurisdiction that is not so transparent anymore. Decisions are made that don't go out for review that might have been reviewed in the past. One of the forces you have with a mega event is something I call the event imperative. We are having this event in 4 years, therefore every barrier must be swept away. And that often means due process. It means review. It means many of the institutions that have played a role in the past suddenly get swept aside because the world will be here in so many years and we have to look good. So it has a mixed benefit. In some cases, it can institute better planning. In other cases, it can cloud and obscure the process even more.
So again, some costs and benefits associated with that.
Yeah.
I'm curious. In a country like China, where the government purportedly has a great deal of authority under its purview, is it easier for those cities to produce a mega event than cities in other function is not as strong?
I think this is a good point. I think certainly the key questions that crop up when you host a mega event, well, who's paying? Where will the money come from? If you have a national government behind you, that certainly makes it easier. Do you have ways of obtaining the land and the planning permits and the decision making? And I think that's another event. I think China in particular has urbanized so quickly that it has many cities of world status that people don't know about. And so Chinese cities really have to try to raise themselves to global visibility somehow. And mega events are one way to do that. This August, Nanjing is hosting the Youth Olympics, which is a new strand of the Olympic movement that targets young people, young athletes. And Nanjing has a very impressive Olympic complex it built for the China Games. It's renovated those facilities for the Youth Olympics. Clearly this is a good way to raise the profile of that city. Guangzhou hosted the Asian Games, raising the profile of the city. So I think in China there are many cities that are seeking to be recognized because by population terms they're larger than most cities in the world. And one way to be noticed is to host a mega event.
But is it at the same time easier for those cities? Shanghai 2010, the Beijing Olympics, have they been able to execute better as a matter of practicality?
I think they both executed well-organized events, but at what cost? Who was displaced, who benefited, and who lost is always one of the decisions. It's not a simple black and white decision. There will be people who gained from these events, and there will be people who lost, people whose houses were needed and who were moved forcefully off the site. So China has the ability to do these types of things very effectively, in part because of the lack of due process in many cases or review processes. So it can be efficient when it makes these events happen. And it has an interest in these events because there is a great demand for visibility. So they can certainly host them, and there's a desire to host them. I think one of the ironies of looking at the 2022 Olympics is that the countries that seem to be left in the race are those countries where public opinion is not part of the calculation. Kazakhstan and Beijing to host the 2022 Winter Olympics. And I think that the countries where the public has a voice, so Norway, Sweden, and Poland, it's been much harder to move these events forward because the public is concerned about what it will cost and who will get the benefits.
I see. That's interesting. War professor. I don't know if we talked about this, but it seems that tourism, as after a city hosts a mega, easy to measure in terms of the trend, before and after uh, becoming a mega event city. Is that one way to measure things? If so.
You can see a rise in tourism. Interestingly, during the mega event itself, tourism can be down. Not so much for World's Fairs, which bring in lots of visitors, but often people shy away. For the London Olympics, lots of people who wanted to go to London decided, I'm not going to London during the Olympics, I can't afford the prices. So London was actually less busy during the Olympics than it normally is, just because the regular tourists didn't go. And a lot of large cities have a lot of tourists that would go anyway. One of the things that will be interesting to see is what do the images of Brazil do for Brazilian tourism in the future. If the images and the event is positive, then it may lead to a growth in visitors. But if people see problems associated with the World Cup, then it may in fact dissuade people from wanting to go.
I see. That's interesting. All right, Professor. Let me ask you about the. Let me ask you some questions about your MOOC
Sure.
now. How did you decide an on-campus class, and what made you decide to turn it into a MOOC or to host a MOOC?
Okay, well, we have a research cluster at MSU, Michigan State University, and there's a lot of expertise spread across our campus dealing with mega events that we've discovered by accident. But with my colleagues, we started the MOOC with the Winter Olympics. So we actually have envisioned a series of MOOCs based on mega events. So in February, we did one on the Winter Olympics, and now we're doing one on the World Cup. Next year, we'll be doing one on the World's Fair, Expo 2015 in Milan, and then, of course, the year after, we have the Summer Olympics. So we see this as a series. And some of the content comes from our own classes, and some of it comes from our sense that there are more stories to be told about these events than gets presented. And I've focused a lot of negative issues today, but there's also a lot of positive sides to these events, the spirit of competition, the individual determination, and even the logistics, the backroom functioning of how do you run an event, what does it take to put something like this on. So we thought that a course that really is more of a social learning course than a classic academic course. We offer academic courses online at MSU about mega event planning that are much more demanding and specific. But we felt for the MOOCs what we wanted to do is just really make people think a little bit about what they're seeing, to ask questions about who built the stadium, who paid for it, what happens next, why is the game played that way, why did the ref just do that. The questions that may not get answered through broadcasting or print media, we feel we can answer through the MOOC. We have experts all over the world who will be joining us. We have experts on the tax structure of FIFA, experts on being a referee in a FIFA match, experts on the laws of soccer, on how you plan transportation. We have an expert on the use of protest movements and sporting events. So we're bringing lots of different voices together, many of which may not get heard, to try to paint a broader perspective of what the World Cup is all about.
I see. And who is the MOOC intended?
From our experience with the Olympics, we really had people from middle school all the way to senior citizens. And the common theme was people were interested in the event, and they were interested in learning more about the event, that they were curious. And hopefully our MOOC helped answer some questions, and they could ask questions. We have a discussion board. We try and bring social media to use so that people can connect over an event that is of shared interest.
I see. I see. And who is it? So you're one who might be interested in these events. Do you see any trends in terms
Yes.
of which types of audiences seem most attracted to take the MOOC?
The MOOC we did on the Winter Olympics was half the United States, half the rest of the world. It spanned all age groups. We had teenagers and we had people in their 80s. So there was no real particular type, as you may expect with some of the more technical and specific MOOCs that are aiming at a certain skill acquisition, a new software that you can program, or something very specific. We're really there to essentially be a companion while the World Cup is on. We're there to say, did you see that? Have you thought about that? What do you think will happen next? It's that type of role we wish to use the MOOC for, which is not always the traditional MOOC format. We did not take an existing class and turn it into a MOOC. We didn't think that would bring the same benefit. We think that it's far more interesting to tap into those people who are curious, who may not necessarily want to commit to a semester-long in-depth analysis, but who are eager to have 4 or 5 weeks of conversations and presentations about the event they're watching.
And tell me about the first MOOC you did that was on the topic of the Olympics. How many did that go?
We had over 1,000 people in that MOOC. As I said, half from the US, half the rest of the world. We had 5 modules. We had guest experts from Europe and from the US commenting, as well as ourselves teaching. It was a very positive experience. We were warned when we planned the MOOC that there would be a fairly significant drop-off in participation. And we were surprised to find that people stayed with the MOOC the entire time. They did, when we surveyed them at the end, they said that they thought that a 4 to 6 week MOOC was good, was ideal. The fact that it wasn't really graded, though there were quizzes you could take, I think was appealing to some, that you weren't really put into a testing environment, led to its popularity as well. The feedback was remarkably positive, 4 and 5 stars out of 5 from more than 80% of the participants. So we were very pleasantly surprised that we kept so many people for so long. And in particular, our last module started after the Olympics ended and was on the legacy. What will the Olympics leave? And we have the same structure for this World Cup. After the last game, we have a module on what will be left. And that had a very strong, it had the second highest number of page views of a week after the first week. So we were very pleased to see people were really interested in what happens when these events end. So we were very pleasantly surprised by how people were attracted to the course.
Oh yeah, that's fantastic. Our research cluster has learned anything or can learn anything from the MOOC in terms of the ideas and opinions of the information sources they have access to, etc.
We try and do something different with each MOOC in a research capacity. And for the Olympics, we were very interested in the use of social media, how willing people were to use social media, how much of a role it played. And one of the things we did for the Olympics, we'll do for the final game of the World Cup, was we engaged in a global Twitter experience of having everyone try to interact, because there's not a lot of times when the whole world is watching the same thing at the same time. And we think that we'll have that with the final game of the World Cup. And it was really interesting seeing how people saw the event. They would tweet their opinions, who they supported, what was interesting to them. One of the findings of this was that we had very different groups. That we had an online discussion board group, we had a Twitter group, and we had a Facebook group, but they weren't the same people. that there were different people that
Mm.
preferred different forms of social media to interact. And that's something that we hadn't really anticipated. We thought that people that were active in one medium would be active in another. But very clearly, people had their preferences for how they interacted. And that's something we're continuing. We have a couple of research ideas for the upcoming MOOC on the World Cup. More will be about the use of Twitter as a global tool for interacting with people. We're also interested in issues of open access to information, where people can get information from. We've talked to Taylor and Francis, who is actually making available a packet of articles at no cost for participants in the MOOC. That normally a lot of copyright protections are put in place, and understandably in many cases. But here we have a leading publisher who is helping us out and saying, for the MOOC, yes, we will provide you with academic articles that normally the public wouldn't be able to easily find. So these are things that we're going to test out this time and see what we can learn from them.
Yes, that's very interesting. And how many participants do you have enrolled so far? And what is the geographic split?
At the moment, we've only been open for a day and a half. So we haven't really been paying too much attention. We launched the 23rd of June after the World Cup has started a little, and we'll go to a week after the World Cup. But we're hoping for thousands. We're looking forward to having more than we had for our Olympic MOOC, and we're also looking for a very diverse and broad global audience that will be promoting the MOOC in a variety of different languages. The MOOC itself is in English, but we will be promoting it in different languages because we feel there are many people, you can imagine college and high school students, who speak English well, but in their day-to-day activities they don't work in English. So we're trying to see if we can reach a different audience of people with English as a second language who might be interested in learning more about the World Cup.
Sure, and I wonder if you could find a volunteer who might translate captions. It seems like you could have a big audience in Brazil.
That's one of the things we're talking about now, is how do we make this accessible? Because there is a global audience for soccer, there's a global audience for MOOCs, and I don't think many MOOCs until recently have really thought about this. About the fact that you've got a lot of good content, how do you make it available? Many people are comfortable with subtitles and would be more than happy to see content in different languages. Yes.
The 50% split in the U.S. Hopefully, it will be more international, given the topic.
Well, we've talked to colleagues around the world, and we're hoping to promote it and get a broad view, because it also makes the discussions more interesting when people from different countries give their take on what's important.
Sure. Professor, one question I wanted to ask you, your research group or your research cluster, is it sponsored university, or is there some other sponsor for this? And how much influence or visibility does your group have within organizations or within cities that are actively thinking about whether or not to bid and produce these mega events? Are you guys involved in the conversation?
At different levels. As I said, we've worked a lot in the past with the US Pavilion at World's Fairs about the role that students can play as ambassadors. And my colleague Efa Cassens-Noor has worked both for the IOC and for host cities for the World Cup in transportation planning. So some of it is direct experience, and so we try to combine analysis of what mega events are all about, but some of the team are also actively engaged in planning future mega events.
Do cities come and seek out your group to get advice and analysis?
Sometimes, yes. As I said, Effa has been asked a number of times for her advice on transportation planning or environmental
Mhm.
planning around the World Cup and the Olympics. We often get asked for feedback, such as you are doing, from the media about how to interpret and understand the significance of an event.
All right. Well, Professor, those are all the questions that I had. Was there anything else pertinent to this that we didn't cover that you wanted to emphasize or point out?
I think a lot of what I have discussed has been somewhat negative, and I need to also point out there are positives. I think I am one who loves the spirit of these events. There's a lot of personal achievement. There's a great excitement when you're in a city hosting a mega event. Just being there is exciting. I've been to a number of host cities during these events, and they are very exciting places to be. I think what you're hearing from myself and some of my colleagues is a little bit of frustration that these events are seen as an end when we would like to have them seen as a means to an end, the means to a better city. We think they're great events. We think there's a lot of fun to be had, a lot of excitement, but we're also concerned that they're not always the best decisions to make if they're not going to be well organized and planned.
Sure. And uh, I want to thank you, Professor, for your time, and I think your perspective that we should think through these things, and whatever the factors are that cities use to host these mega events, they should definitely happens the morning after the party, and whether they can be smart about what they end up with, as well as health.
Well, when the party's over, you can feel good or you can be hungover, and we're going to promote the feel good factor rather than being hungover.
Sure. Think about the consequences. That sounds like the theme that you would want to promote to these cities as they're
Exactly, exactly.
thinking about this. Okay. Well, Professor, I wish you good luck on the MOOC. It should be exciting, and I hope that you get a lot of signing up. We'll do our best to let people know about the MOOC, and it starts June 23rd through the Canvas network, right?
That's correct, and it's been a pleasure to talk to you today as well.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor. Appreciate it, and have a great weekend.
Thank you. You too.
All right, thank you.